Around the turn of the 19th century, a scholar named Johann Griesbach was wrestling with a problem. And this was a problem that, frankly, church fathers had known about. It had been around for centuries, but it was the entrance of this problem into the modern world. And Griesbach basically realized that you could line up the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that you could line up these Gospels and that they had some kind of a relationship to each other. This would eventually be called the synoptic problem. And of course, this has become one of the most well-known problems in biblical studies. A lot of us, a lot of you have probably heard of the synoptic problem. And of course, you might have your favorite interpretation of the synoptic problem. A lot of people do. So scholars disagree over how these relationships actually worked, but most scholars agree that there is a relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But what if the story about gospel relationships is much bigger? What I want to show you is the whole picture at once, that almost every single early Christian text we have is copying, adapting, and reacting to another one. So few of these early Christian texts are actually independent. And once you see this web of interconnection, the synoptic problem actually becomes a lot more complicated. So yes, the synoptic gospels copy each other, but this is just a tiny fragment of the dozens of relationships that we can see between early Christian writings. In this video, I want to show you a reconstruction of some of this web of early Christian writings. And this is relationships that go far beyond Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I want to show you something about those relationships, that they can't all just be waved away as oral tradition. These are like lots of different gospels and writings that seem to have had some sort of literary relationship to one another. And because of these connections that I'm going to show you as we go, I want to suggest that there are very few early Christian texts that we can look at that are actually completely independent. Most of these texts have some sort of relationship to each other. And of course, most of us just know about the synoptic problem. So I want to do a little bit of mapping. This is not going to be a perfect science. And I should say what I'm not going to do is try to untangle this mess, because it really is quite a mess. But scholars have worked on different parts of this, of course, and it's always interesting. So if you're ready for that, that's what I'm going to try to accomplish in this video. And I'm going to show you some different diagrams of how this all works together. Now, before we start, my name is CJ Cornthwaite. Here on YouTube, I talk about where Christianity came from and how it works. And if you're interested in the synoptic problem, I have to point you to an amazing course in the Biblical Studies Academy. It has Mark Goodicker and my PhD supervisor, John Kloppenborg, and they have sort of a combination of lectures that they do together on whether or not this lost gospel that we refer to as Q existed. It's a really interesting course from two of the best in the field who actually fundamentally disagree over this. So this is well worth watching. I will leave a link to that down below. But now let's talk about gospel relationships. So to start with the canonical Gospels, we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And a lot of people know about this relationship. So Matthew uses 90 to 95% of Mark's content, reworks a lot of it. It has about 600 of Mark's verses. Luke uses about 50% of Mark's material, 300 to 350 verses. And of course, there's always a question about like which way the direction of influence went. We'll talk about that a little bit. But I want to talk about the really interesting suggestion that John should be thought of as synoptic. Now, a lot of this is probably going to come down to semantics of how you actually define synoptic. But nevertheless, the question of whether John had a relationship with the synoptic gospels. So I'm going to pull out this book and recommend it. The fourth synoptic gospel. This is Mark Goodicker's book that came out this year. I had a chance to interview Mark on my podcast, which is called Footnote Famous. Maybe I can leave a link to that down below as well. But this is a really interesting book. And Mark essentially in this book he's not the only one who's made this case, but he makes the case that John does actually know the synoptics and is reacting to them and rewriting them. And I really found this book give me a lot to think about, not just in terms of like untangling the synoptic problem or whatever that might look like, but it gave me a lot to think about of how we actually think about synoptics, how we actually think about how gospels interrelate. And one of the really interesting things about this book that has kind of stayed with me is that Mark points out that sometimes gospel writers will take something from whatever gospel they're working with as a source text. They will take something that's in narrative and put it into speech. And this was a really interesting thing, and it's going to come up a few times in this video as we go. But Goodicker suggests that there's a higher dependence by John on the synoptics than most people realize. And one of the really interesting ones he points out is that the I am sayings in John all sort of have precedence in the synoptics. So they're all things that are stories or that happen in the synoptics, and they get turned into I am sayings, the famous like I am the bread of life, I am the door, I am the way, the truth, and the life, these types of things. These are all drawn from the synoptic gospels. And Mark points out in the book that John doesn't say anything like, he could have said like, I am the lighthouse or something. Maybe that's a bad example, but he doesn't actually do that. He just has things that come out of the synoptic gospels. So if you do get a chance to read this book or watch that interview, the thing that really kind of hit home is that we need to expand the way that we think about gospel relationships, not as just like, often we line up these texts, you've probably seen this done, and like, oh, this copied from this, and this text shows up here. But this can be a process of reworking. And what he shows, I think, very convincingly, is that John has done a lot of reworking of the synoptic materials. And Mark Goodacre, in the end, argues that John probably knows all three of the synoptics. So a lot of the things that Goodacre points to in this book are points of crossovers, and they're often not as extensive as what we see in the three synoptic gospels. But nevertheless, there are these kind of points of contact, it looks like, between the synoptics and John. So Mark Goodacre gives the example of Jesus being clothed in a purple coat and people saying to him, "Hail, King of the Judeans," which shows up in Mark, but also in Matthew and John. Or he talks about this example from John, where John the Baptizer talks about baptizing in water, but there's one coming after him. So already, if you take the time to explore this kind of argument, you get a different way to think about synoptics, that ultimately John might be synoptic too, and we have to think about relationships between all four canonical gospels and not just the three that we usually talk about when we talk about synoptic gospels. But I was thinking about this as I interviewed Mark and I was moving kind of out of this conversation. And I was thinking, why stop there? Because frankly, we can do a lot more with a lot more gospel literature than just connect John to the synoptics. One really obvious place to go here would be the Gospel of Thomas. Of course, you might know the story of the Gospel of Thomas. It was found in the early 20th century with a couple Greek fragments at Oxyrhynchus, and then found in full in Coptic at Nag Hammadi. It's famous. It's all, I'm sure you probably know about the Gospel of Thomas. But with the Gospel of Thomas, it turns out that 40 to 50% of sayings in the Gospel of Thomas have parallels in the synoptics. So here's an example at Thomas 20 with the parallel of the parables of the mustard seed. So Gospel of Thomas 20, the disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us what the kingdom of heaven is like." He said to them, "It is a mustard seed. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it falls on tilled soil, it produces a great plant and becomes a shelter for birds of the sky." I won't read the Mark one there, but you can see it on the screen beside the Gospel of Thomas. Or how about this one, Gospel of Thomas 65? This is a very familiar story. He said, "There was a good man who owned a vineyard. He leased it to tenant farmers so that they might work it, and he might collect the produce from them. He sent his servant so that the tenants might give him the produce of the vineyard. They seized his servant and beat him, all but killing him. The servant went back and told his master. The master said perhaps he did not recognize them. He sent another servant. The tenants beat this one as well. Then the owner sent his son, and he said, perhaps they will show respect to my son. Because the tenants knew it was he who was the heir to the vineyard, they seized him and killed him. Let him who has ears hear." Immediately familiar story here in the Gospel of Thomas. And again, the thing I'm not going to do in this video is to start to try to like pull apart how these connections go, because for all of these, there have been books and articles written on them. But nevertheless, let's just point out that there is a connection. There's some kind of a relationship between the Gospel of Thomas and the synoptic material. Another example that Mark Goodacre talks about in that book, and I had seen in other places, is the Protevangelium of James. Now, this is a really interesting Christian text. It's actually the story about the conception of Mary, but also has to do with the conception of Jesus as well. And it is a place that you see some overlap. Again, for example, chapter 14, verses 1 and 2 says, "And Joseph was afraid and took her into his keeping. And Joseph said to her, 'Mary, what have you done? Why have you humiliated yourself? Have you forgotten the Lord your God?' And behold, an angel of the Lord appeared, saying, 'Do not fear this child, for that which is in her is of the Holy Spirit.'" Now, I won't read all of Matthew 1, 18 to 25 here that you can see beside this, but this looks like a really good example of the author of the Protevangelium of James actually doing what Mark Goodacre pointed out in his book, actually turning something that's narrative and putting it more into speech. So where you see here, Matthew tells us that Joseph was kind of upset about it. Protevangelium of James kind of actually puts this into words. So Joseph actually says, Mary, what have you done? Why have you humiliated yourself? So that's a case, it seems, of taking something in Matthew and turning it into speech. But that's an interesting literary technique. And it's still, if you kind of read through what's happening here, you're actually seeing a type of literary relationship. We could even call it a synoptic relationship because there is some kind of connection here. And this is common if you go through the Protevangelium of James. There's more around the birth stories. There's a little bit around John the Baptist, and I'm going to show you these a little bit further on in this video. But again, interesting. Could we add this work to our map of synoptic gospels? Or at the very least, I'm going to get in trouble using that. But let's just say, could we recognize that there's a connection? And that connection probably looks something. So far, we have something that looks like this. How about the Gospel of Peter, another famous early Christian gospel? And again, it looks like a lot of the Gospel of Peter could be adaptations of the synoptic material. So let's look at this example. We have in Mark and Matthew, we have the story about the crucifixion of Jesus. So I'll read these. They're pretty short. I'll read them. Mark 15:24 and 25 says, and they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. Matthew 27:35 says, and when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among them by casting lots. Or how about one more famous one from the Gospel of Peter, where the final words of Jesus on the cross is, my power, why have you forsaken me? Which of course, Mark and Matthew, it's my God, why have you forsaken me? And we often focus on the differences here, of course. Like we often look at like how has this been changed? Or how is it different? And that's an important question to ask. But what about the similarities? This is betraying knowledge. This is likely, like these are just little things, but the way that we can see the details from the canonical gospels show up in the Gospel of Peter, again, suggest a relationship. So if we add this to our map, it looks something like this. But we are just getting started, because one of the things that I got really excited about when I started on YouTube is I had fun diving into gospel fragments, like fragments of lost gospels. It's always been like a source of fascination for me. So there's two that I want to add to this, because these two have some kind of a connection to the synoptic gospel. So the first I want to talk about is P.Oxy 1224, a piece of a lost gospel found at Oxyrhynchus. There are a couple of unique stories on this gospel, but at one point it actually has something very similar. And this is what it says. The scribes and Pharisees and priests watching him were angry because he reclined in the midst of sinners. But Jesus heard them and said, the ones who are healthy have no need for a doctor. Okay, this is very familiar to anybody who has read the canonical gospels. And pray for your enemies, for the one who is not against you is for you. He who is far off today will be near you tomorrow. So again, like the whole fragment of this gospel doesn't all line up, but this shows contact to some extent. And the thing that I think is really interesting and important to recognize is that we have enough of a text here, enough of a similarity between what's happening in not only the synoptics, but we actually get parts of this come up in the Didache as well. And we have these kind of relationships that have to be explained somehow as textual relationships, because there's just too much here. And I think we've kind of sloppily gotten to a place where often people want to explain these kind of crossovers as like oral traditions, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. Like there's a few too many details here, a bit too much crossover in the words and the structure. This actually does look like the same phenomenon we see in the Synoptic Gospels, that this is a literary relationship that this gospel fragment has. Then the next one has an even stronger case for that. So this is P. Egerton. This is another fragment of a lost gospel. It has a couple different stories, one about Jesus healing a leper. But in this particular fragment, it has a section that is identical to a section of the Gospel of John, almost identical, not quite. John has a little bit more added in this little section. But this says, "Search the scriptures in which you think you have life. There are ones who bear witnesses concerning me." So I won't read it all, but you can see here there's actually a perfect agreement here for quite a few words between Egerton and the Gospel of John. And again, I remember back to a time when I had to mark a lot of undergraduate papers, and you would put the papers through this software, Turnitin.com. And if there was like 3 or 4 words that matched, you could assume that unless it was a quote, these students had some kind of copying of each other. And here you have like full sentences that match. So again, a relationship here between Egerton and the Gospel of John, some kind of relationship. So let's add these two to our map of gospel relationships, and we will get something that looks like this. So I had been thinking about how to present this, thinking about this video, and I was thinking, okay, like we have all these gospels that we actually can see the relationships, but then could we add in hypothetical gospels? And this might get a little bit of pushback, so that's okay. But could we add in Q to this? There's a hypothetical Q source. And this is, again, like if you want to watch that course with Mark Whittaker and John Kloppenborg, you can get the case for and against Q. But a lot of scholars still think that there could have been a saying source. This is the Q is the way that we refer to the saying source that Matthew and Luke may have shared in common. So if that is a thing, if it was a real source, then this is actually another point of contact. This is another point of complexity, and Q often gets worked into the way that people talk about the synoptic problem. So you can see here, for example, at Luke 6:20-21, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh." We get the same text in Matthew 5. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." So again, there are different ways to explain this, but in this crossover between the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, it is commonly thought possible that there could be a shared source behind these two texts. But as you might know, Q isn't the only hypothetical source that is thought to have been behind the Gospels. And we're getting into some kind of questionable gray area here. Okay, so I can't tell you that these are sources that we need to consider as part of this problem. But it is interesting to consider the possibility that maybe there is a signs gospel, which was commonly thought to be behind the Gospel of John. Now, some people, like Hugo Mendez, for example, doesn't think this was a thing, so maybe not. But interesting to kind of try and think about it. Some people think maybe there was an independent crucifixion narrative that was behind the crucifixion stories. Again, we don't really know, and this is where we get a little bit too hypothetical for probably the taste of some people watching. So I'm not going to go too far down this particular rabbit hole, but it is interesting to stop and think about the possibility that there could be gospels and writings off stage that we don't actually know about. So as we're trying to put together this like map of early Christian writing, there may be things, actually I would suggest there probably are things that we don't actually know about. So we can't even put into this map because we don't really know. But nevertheless, let's add these two in and we might get something like this. Now, I want to take this a little bit further. There's somebody's work I want to point to, and this is James McGrath. James McGrath wrote this really interesting book on John the Baptist, and I interviewed him on my podcast about that as well. But one of the interesting things James does is he points to the possibility that there could be a Baptist birth narrative behind the gospel stories of Jesus' birth. And this, for example, we see a little bit of this possibility at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke when we have all these stories about the birth of John the Baptist. It seems that these may have been brought in from some kind of a birth narrative. We can see a possible connection with this source. Again, another hypothetical source, but I found the case really strong, really convincing. It's worth checking it out. We can see this connection showing up at the beginning of Luke, where you see all this birth narrative stuff around John the Baptist. And it's really interesting. A lot of that actually lines up with the Protevangelium of James. If you want to know more about that, you should watch that interview too. Maybe I can link to that down below as well. Nevertheless, opens up the possibility that there may have been other sources that feed into our gospels that aren't even necessarily about Jesus. What about a John the Baptist source? Like, that's really interesting to think about. So I'm going to add this in as a possibility just for fun because we're continuing to map these possibilities out. So this could be a John the Baptist story, but here's another gospel that we actually do know about, and this is the Gospel of Marcion. Marcion of Sinope is a famous church leader, 2nd century, from Sinope, which is kind of like on the northern coast of Turkey today. He comes to Rome in the 2nd century. And one of the things, Marcion is later kind of dismissed as a heretic, as you probably know if you know anything about him. And one of the things we know for sure about Marcion is that Marcion had a unique gospel that seems to have had some kind of a relationship to the Gospel of Luke. Now, again, right now in scholarship, this is a hot topic. People are arguing about which was first. Did Marcion write first or did Luke write first? In any case, a lot of the church fathers who later wrote against Marcion accused Marcion of chopping pieces out of the Gospel of Luke to create his own gospel. And there are different perspectives on that. Again, this is one of those things I'm not going to solve in this video, but nevertheless, with Marcion's gospel, we do have another lost gospel that we know about for sure. We actually know for sure that this existed, especially because it gets quoted extensively. And this gospel, Marcion's gospel, represents another connection and maybe another type of way to think about this type of synoptic relationship as gospels being rewritten, either expanded or cut back, or it depends on obviously the goals of whoever's doing this and how we can kind of recreate this relationship. But nevertheless, it's really interesting to stick these kind of things into the possibilities. So here we can add in Marcion right here. And then as I'm trying to wrap my head around mapping all this, I'm thinking about like, what about secret Mark, for example? This is a very controversial gospel. We don't know if it's authentic. There's a really good argument that it could be a forgery. There's an argument that it may have been a different version of the Gospel of Mark that has a few extra stories in it. I think we have some stuff in the BSA on that. Maybe I can link to that in the description below. I know that Craig Evans has done some stuff in the Secret Gospel of Mark and a few other people. Still a very, very interesting topic. And the thing about the Secret Gospel of Mark, again, is if it were real, it would suggest that there were different versions of gospels circulating. And this is really interesting to think about. And then you have other gospels that church fathers talk about, like the Gospel of the Hebrews or the Gospel of the Egyptians. We don't have these gospels anymore. But again, what kind of relationships did these have to our gospels? This is like, we just can't actually know. This is like beyond the scope of anything I could even hypothesize for this kind of a video. But did they have a relationship? Presumably, based on everything we've seen, they probably did. And then just to really make our heads spin, we could think about independent stories that may have fed in, independent little units of text. And the one that's really obvious here is the famous pericope adultery in between John 7 and John 8, the story of the woman taken in adultery, which doesn't actually show up in any of our earliest texts. In fact, Eusebius says that it's actually from the Gospel of the Hebrews. This is a beautiful mess of interrelated texts. And as I was working through this, I was thinking about a couple of things. On the one hand, I was thinking about the way that oral tradition often functions here, because I think often what happens is that oral tradition has come to be a shorthand to explain a lot of connections between gospels. And often it happens, I think maybe I'm judging a little bit here, but I think it often happens when people are uncomfortable with relationships. It's easier to say oral tradition than it is to say maybe, X gospel copied this gospel or whatever. So it's interesting when you look at these kind of texts, there are maybe a couple of these relationships that I've showed you today. Maybe a couple could be explained by oral traditions, but we don't really have a good sense that that's the best way to explain them. It seems that the simplest way to explain these kinds of relationships is that something like the synoptic problem is happening for all of these texts, that essentially each of these authors of these gospels or early Christian writings is using other writings as a source. Now, we could look at the synoptics and say, like, this is the place that it happens the most, and I think that's definitely true, but it does seem that all of these writings are using this technique to some extent. And again, that's why you get this mess of interrelationships. It's really hard to figure out. It's really hard. I mean, we can't solve the synoptic problem, let alone all of these other like mini synoptic problems, but it's really hard to go between these and be like, which came first? What's the relationship? You just can't. It's really a mess. But it's really cool to look at this as the network of early Christian writings, network of early Christian writers. And to imagine, I think I could point to Robin Walsh's work here, to imagine something like this literary network of scribes, of cultural producers, even elite cultural producers is the word that she uses, who have created these works and are drawing on each other and riffing on each other and borrowing from each other and all that sort of thing. And that is the picture we actually get when we look at early Christian writings. But there's one final thing I want to point to, and I want to close with this. It seems that there aren't really very many truly independent Christian writings. And I think often we work with these divides, and like people will focus, for example, in canonical gospels. This is just the way that often this gets studied. It's like the synoptic problem is a canonical gospel problem. But really, it's just an early Christian writing problem. Really, this is just about early Christian writing culture and how it gets done. And again, like we think about, there used to be a thing where we think about texts as being from like different communities. And again, this is something else Robin Walsh's work has spoken to as well. But we used to think about like, oh, there's this community had their text and this community has their text. And like, actually what we see. We can't piece together communities behind these texts, but it does look like all of these texts have some sort of a relationship. And you probably don't have a relationship if you are in isolated, independent communities with completely different theology and completely different ideas. And no, what happens is changes are made to existing texts. Edits are made. Texts are shared. Texts are circulated. And that is why we get this beautiful mess. Let me put it up on the screen one more time here. That's why we get this really beautiful mess of interrelationships. I hope that was interesting to you. Let me know down in the comments if it all made sense. Let me know if I went too far with my recreations. I'm willing to admit it's not a perfect science, but hopefully this is like a useful exercise for thinking through some of this stuff. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, don't forget, take a second, do that now. There's so much good stuff coming out all the time for people like Bart Ehrman, Misquoting Moses, a new podcast that's going on. So it's really fantastic. Watch for that. Also, that course that I mentioned at the beginning with John Kloppenborg and Mark Goodacre, I will link to that down below as well. It's well worth a watch. A really great course with two of the best synoptic scholars that are working today. So definitely well worth a watch. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I'll see you next time.